Well, 23 years ago, I kneeled down and I prayed a humble prayer to the Lord. I was 15 years old. I said, Lord, I want to be happy. I want to live a nice life. Please make me a famous rock star. And so I did my part. I started a band called Pet Peeve. It was seriously our band name. And judging by the name, I'm sure you can tell how awesome our music was. We played a couple shows. We had a lot of fun. But in the end, it seemed like God didn't even like our music because at the end of it all, we still weren't famous. And so, we got a little older. We got a little wiser. And we went our separate ways. And so what did I do at the age of 17? I started another band. And I called this band Let's Go Angus, and we were headed for fame. But as I'm sure you can tell, that didn't really go as planned as either. It seemed like my hopes and dreams, my prayers for happiness were fading away. And that's until I actually grew up. And I realized that I think being famous would be the worst thing in the world. Like everywhere you go, people recognize you. And when I look back, I realized that I think God really did answer my prayers. Because at the heart of my prayer was, I want to live a life of meaning and a good life, a happy life, those types of things, life with excitement. And I feel like my life with my wife Amber and our 3 boys and all the crazy adventures we've had over the last 20 years have certainly been that. Things didn't go my way. But I learned it's okay when things go God's way. And I'm sure each of you probably have something similar that when you look back on your life, there's something that you wanted so much. Maybe you prayed for a relationship to hang in there, or for somebody that you really liked to fall in love with you. Or maybe it's for a job or goals that you had that you really wanted to see come to pass, and it didn't go as you planned. But when you look back, you're thankful that, you know what? I'm glad things went God's way. This divergent desire between what humanity often wants and what God, his purposes are in life, is really showcased today. And in the first reading, when we're outside and we came in, we read about Jesus' triumphal entry, often called Palm Sunday. And on the surface, it looks perfect. Even just be out there and reenact it this morning with all the palm branches and all these types of things and coming in, right? The people of Jerusalem, they've come out to meet Jesus, and they're giving him the welcome that he finally deserves. They're throwing their cloaks on the ground, they're singing, they're praising that the Messiah has come. And John even goes as far to tell us that the people took palm branches and they went out to meet him, and they were shouting, Hosanna, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. Blessed is the King of Israel. It's beautiful. It's perfect. Except things are apparently not as perfect as they seem. If we read just a few verses past this morning's reading when we came in this morning, there comes this interesting twist, and it shows up in verse 41. So we read to verse 40, this is verse 41. As Jesus approached Jerusalem and he saw the city, he wept over it. And he said, if you, even you, had only known on this day what would bring you peace, but now it's hidden from your eyes. The days will come upon you when your enemies will build an embankment against you, and they'll encircle you and hem you in on every side. They will dash you to the ground, you and the children within your walls. They will not leave one stone on the other, because you did not recognize the time of God's coming to you. Wait a minute, what? You did not recognize the time of God's coming to you. So this huge crowd has pulled out all the stops. They're in the streets with the palm branches, throwing their coats on the ground, saying, blessed is the King of Israel. And Jesus is saying they didn't recognize him. This just like blowing my mind this last week. Like, what is going on in this passage? What are we missing here? And so it really helps, as it always is, to understand the context, to enter into what is it like to be in the sandals of the people in the crowd? What would it be like to be them? What were they looking for? And the Jews were well studied in Messianic prophecy. They really did believe Jesus is the Messiah. They knew that the Messiah would be born in Bethlehem, that he would perform signs and miracles, that he would usher in a new era of freedom and of peace, that he would establish God's kingdom. And peace up to this point And even mostly today, peace is achieved through warfare. Or as we like to say, peace through superior firepower. So the people believed God's Messiah would have to be some sort of warrior king. Someone who could come in and bring in lasting peace. And how else could God's kingdom be established? And Jesus sure fit the bill for the Messiah, right? He's born in Bethlehem, check. Signs and miracles, huge check mark. In fact, even in John chapter 6, the crowds were so convinced that Jesus was the Messiah after feeding 5,000 people, they wanted to make him the king right there. It says, this is jumping back to John chapter 6, it says, surely this is the prophet who comes into the world. When Jesus perceived that they were about to come and take him by force and make him king, he departed again to the mountain all by himself. Jesus was the perfect Messiah, right? Just imagine if we had a king who was kind, could feed thousands of people on scarce resources. That would be amazing. And who could heal every handicap and disease. This Jesus is super powerful. Imagine what he could do if we put a weapon in his hand. And the people of Jerusalem and of Israel total, they were dying literally for a strong leader to free them from Roman oppression. It had been over 200 years since they had a strong leader come through and had got them some freedom. And that strong leader is really the key to understanding why is it that Jesus is saying that they missed God's visitation on this day? So maybe some of you are students of history. This will be a review for you. But in 165 BC, Israel was on the edge of the Seleucid Empire. So the Seleucid Empire is the Syrian dynasty that followed Alexander the Great. And Antiochus, which was their king, he didn't want to just come over and occupy Jerusalem. He wanted a grip on it. He wanted to control all of the region of Judah. And so under the guise of peace, he and his army entered the walls of Jerusalem and suddenly turned on everyone. And they systematically tortured and killed Jews. And then he stole all the ecclesiastical items from the temple and desecrated the altar by burning a pig on it. And he forced the Jews to worship pagan gods. And all of this is in the apocryphal book, First Maccabees. But there was a young man named Judas Maccabeus. He was the son of a priest. And he was infuriated. And he led a spontaneous revolt. It just pops up out of nowhere. Like this guy's just like, I've had enough. Whoever's with me, we're going. And surprisingly, that revolt turns into something huge, and they expelled the Seleucid Empire out of Jerusalem. So in a short period of time, they go from the absolute worst oppression one could ever imagine to total freedom. So you can imagine how excited all these people are. Like, this is amazing. Wow. And Judas Maccabeus, he is a national hero. So upon his army's return, the people of Jerusalem flood the streets to celebrate. And we read this in 1 Maccabees. On the 23rd day of the second month, in the 175th year, the Jews entered Jerusalem with praise and palm branches, and with harps and cymbals and stringed instruments, and with hymns and songs, because a great enemy had been crushed and removed from Israel. An ocean of waving palm branches did more to capture the excitement of that day than anything else. It was unforgettable. So unforgettable and memorable that very same year they began stamping palm branches into their coins. Palm branches became the primary symbol of Jewish sovereignty and Jewish strength. Unfortunately, that peace did not last long, as only just 100 years later, Rome finally came along and they did what the Seleucid Empire could not do. And they did subjugate Jerusalem. Now fast forward, Jesus is coming to Jerusalem. And these people are weary and longing for freedom. And they're convinced that Jesus is the one who's going to finally bring them that lasting freedom and peace that Judas Maccabeus could only do for a short period of time. And here he is coming to Jerusalem, as they believe, to exert his authority. He's going to come in He's going to go to the throne and be like, all right, there's a new king in town. So the people go into the streets and they effectively reenact the same celebration that they did the last time, that a victorious warrior entered Jerusalem. But the only problem is while Jesus is indeed the Messiah, and they're saying it, so what they're saying is true, just like Jesus says, the rocks will cry out. But he's not the Messiah that they think he is. They want a revolution, but Jesus is bringing them redemption. They want freedom from Rome, but Jesus is bringing them freedom from sin and death. They want peace won by the sword. Instead, Jesus is bringing them peace with God through a cross. They want to become the most powerful nation in the world. They want the world to fear them, to respect them. But Jesus was opening the kingdom of God to Jews and Gentiles alike. Which, thank God, because I'm not a Jew. I'm glad Jesus was like, you can come too. And this is why Jesus doesn't come thundering in on a war horse, which would be the normal thing to do, but he shows up on a lowly donkey. Did you know that the donkey makes it into every gospel account? All four cameos or all four Palm Sunday processions have the donkey in it. But palm branches only show up one time, and that's in the Gospel of John. Yet when we think of the triumphal entry, palm branches are the thing that we usually associate the most with the triumphal entry. That's why we call it Palm Sunday, right? But it was people who chose the palms. Jesus chose a donkey. And in so doing, fulfilled Zechariah 9:9, which says, "Rejoice greatly, O daughter of Zion. Shout aloud, O daughter of Jerusalem. Lo, your king comes to you. Triumphant and victorious is he, humble, riding on a donkey. On a colt, the foal of a donkey." You see, I think it's actually all about the donkey, not the palm branches. And maybe we should start calling it Donkey Sunday. I wish my kids a happy Donkey Sunday right when I walked out the door this morning. But it doesn't really quite roll off the tongue as well as Palm Sunday. But there's something truly important here, right? Jesus chose a donkey, a very gentle, very lowly, kind-hearted animal, to signify who he was and what he's about. He is the bringer of peace, true peace, not the kind of peace that's won by the sword, not some temporary peace that's here today and gone tomorrow, but the kind of abiding peace that the Bible tells us surpasses all understanding. And so Jesus was showing them and showing us who read it today that his purpose was our peace. And regardless of what the multitude wanted him to do, like, let's go in, let's throw Rome, let's start, pull out swords and all this kind of stuff. Let's go to the palace. But Jesus doesn't go to the palace. He goes to the cross. Palm Sunday ends up being the last time we ever see anybody really excited to see Jesus. This is really the peak of the fanfare. And over the next week, the people come to realize this Messiah we welcomed in like the other day is not the guy we thought he was. And this is why Jesus said that they missed him. It's why just 5 days later, the crowds cry out like we did this morning, "Crucify him." This guy is just making things up. He's not the guy we thought he was. It's also why Jesus wept over Jerusalem, because he knew in their thirst for war that eventually they would be crushed by Rome. And that happens in 70 AD, just as he said it would. And you can really hear the sadness in Jesus' voice in Luke 19:42, which we read earlier. He says, "Would that you, even you, had known on this day the things that would have made for your peace. But now they're hidden from your eyes." And I think what we learn from all of this is that we should always be open to the possibility that God may be working out what's best for us in ways that we don't expect. We think we know what we want. We think we know what would be best to fix our problems. But the reality is that God knows the things that will actually make for peace in our lives. He knows it better than we do. Isaiah 55, which is a chapter we've actually referenced a lot throughout Lent, says this, "For my thoughts are not your thoughts, neither are my ways your ways, declares the Lord. As the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts are higher than your thoughts." So maybe we're actually a little bit more like the people in the crowd than we think. As is often the case, I usually think of people that met Jesus, like, how did they miss it? And then you kind of get to know like what they were thinking, like, I probably would have missed it too. When life gets difficult, I'm prone to grasp for control. I start to fear that God, maybe he's got other things going on. What if he's abandoned us? What if we do nothing? If I do nothing, I can't just sit around and pray. I got to do stuff, right? And to a certain extent, it is important that we make good, smart, wise decisions and plan for our lives. But there's another step where we're like, you know what, God, I can kind of tell where you're going, but I don't want to go that way. I want to go this way. And when we do that, we usually find ourselves in uncharted territory. It often doesn't end well. And we feel like unless we take things into our own hands, things are going to get worse. But the reality is, and the testimony of Christians throughout the ages, alive today and throughout thousands of years, is that God is a good God. He's a good God who promises that everything that we entrust to him is in the safest place it could ever be. The welfare of the people you love, if it's in the hands of God, best place ever. Even through all the ups and downs and even the detours, God's purposes are always good. It's okay when things go God's way. And we see this kind of trust in an old story. Many of you may be familiar with this story, but it's the story of Joseph in the Old Testament. Joseph had 11 brothers, and they all hated his guts. They hated his guts because Jacob favored Joseph the most. And so finally, they all go out to the field and they conspire like, you know what? We're totally sick of this guy. There's a well right over here. So they take Joseph, they throw him in the well. They're going to leave him for dead. But by chance, an Egyptian slave trader happens to be coming by. And they see this opportunity. They go, wait a minute, we can make a lot of cash and not live with the guilt of having killed him. So they pull him out of the well and they sell him to a slave trader, split the reward and tell their dad he was eaten by a lion, right? Now, could you imagine being Joseph? Like, you're just in the well, like, I'm going to die. Then they pull you out and they sell you into slavery. You're like, where is God in any of this? Then in Egypt, things start to get better. He's gaining some trust from his slave, or his master. He's enjoying a bit of freedom, but then his master's wife tries to smooch him. It's the PG version, and he refuses, and realizing it would be a great sin and a violation of his master's trust. So she gets angry, tells her husband, and then he ends up in jail for doing the right thing. Where is God in any of this? But Joseph doesn't lose faith, and eventually God gave him the answer to a dream that Pharaoh had. A famine was coming. And Egypt needed to prepare. And so Pharaoh's so impressed, like, nobody can interpret this dream. All my magicians, all these people couldn't figure it out. But this guy, hanging down on the gallows, he knows what's up. He's got God on his side. So he pardons him completely and says, not only do I want you to take over the famine stuff, but I'm going to make you second in command of all of Egypt. And in one day becomes the vice president of Egypt. Now, fast forward a couple years, the famine does strike. Crops and livestock all over the place are dying, even those out in the regions where his family live. And they hear Egypt has provisions. And so they travel having no idea that the brother that they sold into slavery is now the vice president. And at first, the brothers show up, but they don't recognize him. But when they finally do, they're like, totally terrified. Here this guy is, he has all the power. Like, the dynamics have changed. He could crush you. He could kill all of them if he wanted to. And many people would be like, you know what? Serves him right. They threw him in a well and they sold him into slavery. This is his chance. But this is what we hear him say to his brothers. Joseph sees how God has used all of it. Do not be distressed and do not be angry with yourselves for selling me. Because it was to save lives that God sent me ahead of you to preserve for you a remnant on earth and to save your lives by a great deliverance. And he later tells them these great words. What you meant for evil, God meant for good. What you meant for evil, God meant for good. Even when Joseph likely thought God wasn't working in his life, it turns out that he was. It's okay when things go God's way. Even in the worst of circumstances, we can trust in God's goodness. We can place our cares, our concerns, and our worries, our prayers, our hopes, our fears, our habits and setbacks, our lack, our brokenness. We can place all these things in the strong and capable hands of a God who loves us, of a Savior who came all the way here for us. And we may not always understand what God is doing, just like these people on Palm Sunday, on Donkey Sunday. They didn't fully understand what God was doing, but we can trust that he knows the things that will make for our peace. Principally, the true and lasting peace he secured by passing that palace and by heading to the cross.